The first light of dawn painted the horizon in hues of orange and pink as Ethan Walker, a seasoned wildlife conservationist, drove up the gravel path toward Evergreen Ridge Sanctuary. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, a mix of anticipation and disbelief coursing through him. The early morning call from his colleague had been brief yet unsettling. "Ethan, you need to see this. It defies everything we know." The sanctuary, nestled in the Montana wilderness, was a place where injured and orphaned animals found refuge before being reintroduced into their natural habitats. Ethan had dedicated over 2 decades of his life to this work, yet nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. As he pulled into the parking lot, Dr. Sophia Lynn, the sanctuary's lead wildlife biologist, was already waiting for him. Her usual composed demeanor was tinged with barely contained excitement. "Come with me," she said, leading him toward the observation room. The footage on the screen was grainy but unmistakable, a massive brown bear, at least 400 pounds, circling the northern perimeter of the sanctuary. What caught Ethan's breath, however, was not the size of the bear, but the way it moved, not like an aimless wanderer, but with deliberate purpose. It wasn't foraging, wasn't marking territory. It was waiting. Then he saw it, a small crescent-shaped scar on its left ear. His coffee cup slipped from his grasp, shattering on the floor. His mind spiraled back to a morning 8 years ago, when a frail bear cub named Koda had first arrived at the sanctuary. Koda's story had made headlines across the state. Found as a newborn inside his deceased mother's body, a tragic victim of illegal hunting, he had been given almost no chance of survival. But Ethan had refused to give up. He had stayed by Koda's side through countless sleepless nights, using every bit of his expertise to keep the cub alive. Against all odds, Koda had not only survived but thrived. Ethan had designed a unique rehabilitation program just for him. Unlike other bears, Koda had needed more than just food and medical care, he had needed trust. Day by day, Ethan had taught him how to forage, how to recognize danger, how to live like a true wild bear. And Koda had learned fast. But what had set him apart was something no scientific paper could explain: he had formed an unbreakable bond with his caretaker. But when funding cuts forced the sanctuary to release Koda earlier than planned, Ethan had been devastated. The moment the tracking collar had gone silent years later, he had forced himself to accept what every expert said: wild animals don't remember their human caretakers. But now, as he watched the footage of the bear outside the sanctuary, moving with familiar precision, his world turned upside down. "Are you sure it's him?" Sophia whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the fragile reality before them. Ethan could barely breathe. It had to be. The movements, the calculated approach, it was as if Koda had stepped straight out of the past. But it didn't make sense. No rehabilitated bear had ever returned like this. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Koda was back. The radio on Ethan's belt crackled. "We have movement along the northern fence," a voice reported. "He's getting closer." Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he straightened. "Get the research team ready," he instructed. "If this is really happening, we're about to witness something that could change everything we know about wildlife rehabilitation." He stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting at his skin. Around him, the sanctuary staff moved with careful precision, setting up observation points, ensuring cameras were rolling. Every person knew they were standing on the edge of something unprecedented. The sun crept higher, burning away the morning fog, revealing the vast wilderness beyond. Ethan raised his binoculars, scanning the tree line. Then, a ripple of movement. The birds stopped singing. Small animals scurried for cover. A presence was approaching. And then, out of the shadows, he emerged. A giant brown bear, fur gleaming under the golden light, muscles rippling beneath years of survival. He moved with the confidence of an apex predator, but there was something else. Something different. Ethan felt his throat tighten as he watched Koda pause at the edge of the clearing. He wasn't prowling, he wasn't hunting. He was waiting. The air around the sanctuary stilled, as if the very earth understood the weight of this moment. Then Koda did something no wild bear should have done. He lifted his head, sniffed the air, and sat down. Not in a defensive stance. Not in a territorial claim. In the exact training position Ethan had taught him years ago. A collective gasp rippled through the sanctuary staff. No one moved. No one spoke. Ethan's fingers tightened around the binoculars. This wasn't a coincidence. Science dictated that wild animals forget their human interactions, that instinct erases memory. But Koda's actions were challenging everything they thought they knew. As the morning sun bathed the sanctuary in light, Ethan's heart pounded with the realization. This was more than a reunion. This was proof that the bonds formed in those early days had never truly faded. And now, after 8 long years in the wilderness, Koda had come home. The moment stretched into eternity as Ethan stood frozen, his gaze locked onto the massive form of Koda. The bear remained still, his deep brown eyes reflecting something that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine: recognition. Every instinct told Ethan to stay cautious. Wild bears didn't exhibit this kind of behavior. A rehabilitated bear returning after 8 years was already unheard of, but to behave as though he remembered Ethan? That was beyond any documented wildlife behavior. And yet, here Koda was, sitting in the exact position Ethan had taught him all those years ago. A hushed murmur spread through the gathered staff. Cameras clicked, binoculars zoomed in. And researchers whispered notes into recorders. The tension in the air was electric. "Ethan," Dr. Sophia Lynn's voice broke through the radio, hushed yet urgent. "What's the protocol here? Do we intervene?" Ethan took a slow, steadying breath. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to move forward, but logic held him back. This was unprecedented. He had spent his entire career ensuring that rehabilitated animals could survive independently, teaching them to leave human contact behind. If he walked toward Koda now, would he undo all those years of carefully constructed boundaries? "Koda," Ethan whispered, barely audible, his voice carrying across the quiet sanctuary. The bear's ears flicked. Then, in a movement so deliberate it sent another wave of shock through the crowd, Koda raised his right paw, the same gesture Ethan had once taught him as a signal to begin training. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. 8 years. 8 years. And Koda still remembered. The step forward. The sanctuary held its breath as Ethan took his first slow step forward. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to stop. But his heart told him otherwise. Koda didn't move, didn't retreat. Instead, he let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, not a warning, but something softer. Familiar. Ethan took another step. Behind him, Sophia's voice came through the radio again. "Ethan, be careful." He didn't respond. His entire world had narrowed to the space between him and the bear he had once raised. Koda exhaled, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his massive body onto all fours and took a single step forward. The earth barely trembled beneath his weight. But to Ethan, it felt like the entire planet had shifted. Breaking the rules. "Ethan, should we?" Sophia started, but Ethan raised a hand, silencing her. Koda had stopped again. Now just 50 feet away. Waiting. A wild bear should have been wary, aggressive, or at the very least, disinterested. But Koda was none of those things. His body language was neither defensive nor territorial, it was something different. something intentional. Ethan took another step, then another, until he was close enough to see every detail of the bear's fur. The old crescent-shaped scar on his left ear stood out starkly against the golden-brown coat. His powerful frame was filled out with years of survival, his muscles taut and strong. But his eyes, they were the same. The same intelligent, soulful eyes Ethan had looked into 8 years ago. "Koda," Ethan whispered again, his voice barely carrying over the morning air. Then, Koda did something that left everyone speechless. He lowered his head. Not in submission. Not in fear. But in recognition. A stunned gasp echoed across the sanctuary. Ethan's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was impossible. The bear held the position for a long, waited moment before lifting his head again. He took another step forward and then he sat. And then, mirroring the actions of a much younger bear from years ago, he raised his paw again. A silent message. A question. A test of trust. The memory slammed into Ethan with the force of a tidal wave. This was the exact sequence Koda had performed as a cub when he was ready to start his morning lessons. It had been their unspoken language, a bond that went beyond mere conditioning. Ethan swallowed past the lump in his throat. "You remember," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Koda rumbled again, a deep, resonant sound that was neither aggressive nor dismissive. It was acknowledgement. A choice. Ethan knew he was standing at a crossroads. If he reached out, if he acknowledged Koda in return, he would be defying every principle of wildlife rehabilitation. Every rule dictated that a human should never interfere with a bear that had successfully adapted to the wild. But Koda had come back. Why? Had he simply wandered here by chance? Or was there something deeper at play, something science had yet to explain? Ethan's hand twitched at his side. He knew every camera was trained on him. He knew every biologist, every researcher, every skeptic in the sanctuary was watching, waiting. For a long moment. He hesitated. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his own hand. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world stood still. Then Koda, the fully wild bear who had survived 8 years in the harsh wilderness, did the unthinkable. He leaned forward and lightly tapped his massive paw against the air. Right where Ethan's hand had been. A silent agreement. A bridge that had never truly broken. The sanctuary erupted into whispers. The researchers scrambled to document the behavior. The cameras captured every second of the impossible moment. But Ethan barely heard any of it. His entire world was filled with nothing but the bear in front of him, the bear that had returned against all logic, against all odds. And deep in his chest, Ethan knew, this was only the beginning. The air between them remained still, heavy with the weight of something unspoken yet deeply understood. Ethan barely dared to breathe as he watched Koda lower his paw, the silent exchange between them shifting something deep within him. This was no ordinary animal encounter, this was recognition, a connection that time and distance had failed to sever. The sanctuary staff, normally so strict with protocol, stood in stunned silence. Their equipment recording every second. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the natural world itself acknowledged the importance of this moment. Ethan swallowed hard. His heart pounding. Koda had come back, not just as a visitor, but as something more. But why? The bridge between worlds. Despite the overwhelming emotions swirling inside him, Ethan's instincts remained sharp. He had spent years studying bears, understanding their behaviors, their triggers, their boundaries. And yet, here in this moment, everything he had been taught felt incomplete. Koda had not come for food. He had not come out of curiosity. He had come because some fragment of memory, some deep-rooted connection, had drawn him back to the only home he had ever known before the wilderness claimed him. Ethan took a careful step forward. Koda didn't flinch. Instead, he exhaled a slow, deep breath, his body language still relaxed. The trust between them was intact, but it was fragile. A delicate thread that could snap if mishandled. Slowly, Ethan extended his hand, not to touch, but simply to exist within Koda's space, to show that he acknowledged his presence without imposing upon it. The bear watched him closely, his dark eyes scanning Ethan as if reading his soul. Then, to the disbelief of everyone watching, Koda stepped forward. The ground barely trembled under his weight. But the impact of his movement shook Ethan's very core. The bear's massive form loomed over him, but there was no fear. Instead, there was an inexplicable calmness, a mutual understanding forged over years of trust, separation, and survival. Ethan felt an almost instinctive pull to kneel, to make himself smaller, less threatening. He lowered himself to the ground, his eyes never leaving Koda's. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Koda did something truly astonishing. He leaned his head forward, just enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his breath against his skin. The bear's nose hovered inches away from Ethan's extended hand, sniffing, assessing, remembering. And then, he closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against Ethan's palm. Gasps rippled through the sanctuary staff. But Ethan barely heard them. His entire world had narrowed to this one moment, this silent, profound exchange of trust and familiarity. Koda had made his choice. He remembered. Echoes of the past. Time lost all meaning as Ethan remained there, one hand resting gently against the bear's thick fur. The memories crashed over him like waves, the sleepless nights spent nursing Koda back to health. The first time he learned to fish in the sanctuary's river, the way he used to nuzzle against Ethan's arm as a cub. Did Koda remember all of it? Or just the feeling of safety? Of companionship? It didn't matter. What mattered was that this moment, against all odds, was happening. Eventually, Koda pulled away, his deep eyes studying Ethan one last time before turning his gaze toward the vast wilderness beyond the sanctuary's borders. It was as if he were standing between two worlds, the one he had been raised in and the one he now belonged to. A choice had to be made. Ethan knew better than to try and hold on to him. Koda was a wild bear, a creature of the mountains, the rivers, the forests. He had survived without human interference for 8 years. He didn't belong in captivity, and Ethan would never take that freedom from him. But part of him ached at the thought of Koda leaving again, vanishing into the wild where he might never be seen again. The bear let out a soft, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh. Then, he turned back toward the trees. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Was this it? Was Koda saying goodbye? But just as he reached the edge of the forest, Koda paused. Slowly. Deliberately, he lifted his right paw one final time, the same signal he had once used as a cub when he was ready to train. Ethan couldn't stop the tears from welling in his eyes. This was not an ending. This was an acknowledgement. And with that, Koda disappeared into the trees. A legacy that endures. The sanctuary was never the same after that day. Koda's return changed the way they understood rehabilitated wildlife. The event sparked a wave of new research into long-term memory in bears, challenging decades of conventional wisdom. Scientists, researchers, and conservationists from around the world sought out Ethan and his team, eager to learn from the encounter. Ethan himself found a renewed sense of purpose. He had always known his work mattered, but now he understood something deeper: the bonds formed between humans and animals were not so easily broken. Months passed, and though Koda did not return as he had that fateful morning, traces of him lingered. Sanctuary cameras occasionally caught glimpses of a massive brown bear prowling the outskirts of the reserve. Always keeping his distance, always staying just within sight. tracks were found near the river where he had once learned to fish. And on rare occasions, in the quiet hours of dawn, Ethan would step outside and swear he heard the faintest, familiar rumbling sound echoing through the trees. A reminder. A connection that neither time nor distance could erase. Koda had found his place in the wild. But a part of him would always belong to the man who had once saved him. The world kept moving after Koda disappeared into the trees. But for Ethan, time had slowed. He stood at the forest's edge long after the massive bear had faded into the undergrowth, his mind swirling with emotions too complex to fully grasp. Had it been real? Had Koda truly returned, remembered, and chosen to acknowledge their bond after 8 years in the wild? The sanctuary staff remained in a stunned hush, still processing what they had just witnessed. The cameras had recorded it all, the silent exchange, the impossible memory, the connection that defied logic. It wasn't just an emotional moment, it was scientific history in the making. A scientific breakthrough. Within days, the footage spread through conservation circles like wildfire. Wildlife researchers, behavioral scientists, and journalists descended upon Evergreen Ridge Sanctuary, eager to study what had happened. This challenges everything we know about animal cognition, Dr. Julian Carter, a leading researcher in animal memory, said during an on-site interview. Bears aren't supposed to retain memories of human relationships after so many years, let alone exhibit signs of emotional recognition. But Koda did. The implications are staggering. Conservationists had long debated whether human interaction during rehabilitation permanently altered an animal's wild instincts. But Koda's return proved something beyond adaptation. It proved that the bonds formed in those early days could last a lifetime. For weeks, scientists studied the footage frame by frame, analyzing Koda's behavior. His movements mirrored learned behaviors, not random instincts. He had approached with purpose. He had sat in the position Ethan had taught him. He had even lifted his paw, the exact signal he had used as a cub. This isn't conditioning, Dr. Carter argued in a scientific paper published weeks later. This is memory. Deep, emotional memory. Wildlife sanctuaries around the world began to re-evaluate how they handled rescues. Could rehabilitated animals remember? Could early human bonds remain intact despite years in the wild? For Ethan, the moment had been intensely personal. But now, it was changing the world. Ethan's dilemma. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself caught between scientific scrutiny and personal reflection. Every morning, he walked the sanctuary grounds, half expecting to see a massive shadow moving through the distant trees. But Koda had not returned. Yet, he had left signs. Sanctuary cameras picked up traces of a bear lingering at the outskirts. Large paw prints were found near the river where Koda had once learned to fish. Deep scratch marks were etched into the same training logs Ethan had used during Koda's cub years. "He's out there," Ethan whispered to himself one morning, running his fingers over the fresh claw marks. He hasn't forgotten. And Ethan hadn't either. One evening, after finishing his rounds, he sat on the porch of the sanctuary's main lodge, watching the treetops sway in the fading light. He thought about everything, the years spent raising Koda, the pain of his release, the shock of his return. A part of him had wished Koda would stay, even though he knew it was impossible. Koda belonged to the wild now. But did the wild belong to Koda? The sanctuary had always been a bridge between two worlds. A place where orphaned animals found temporary refuge before reclaiming their rightful place in nature. Yet Koda's case had blurred that line. He had returned not for help, not for food, but for something deeper, a sense of home. Ethan exhaled deeply, staring at the tree line. "If he ever comes back," he murmured, "I'll be here." The unexpected visit. Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains in thick snow. The sanctuary staff adjusted their schedules, ensuring that food supplies were stocked and all the rescued animals were prepared for the harsh season. Ethan had begun to accept that Koda might not return. Perhaps that one morning had been a miracle meant to last only once. But fate had other plans. One bitterly cold night, the motion sensors at the northern perimeter triggered an alert. Ethan was already awake, unable to sleep, when the radio crackled to life. Movement at the north fence, Sophia's voice came through. "It's big." Ethan was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his coat and heading out into the snow. His breath formed clouds in the freezing air as he jogged toward the perimeter, flashlight bouncing in his grip. When he arrived, the sight nearly stopped his heart. There, just beyond the fence line, stood Koda. Snow clung to his thick fur, and his massive frame looked even more imposing against the pale landscape. His eyes, however, were the same, deep, dark, filled with something no science could quantify. The sanctuary staff arrived seconds later, gasping at the sight. No one moved. No one spoke. Koda was back. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two small cubs stood just behind him, their fur dusted with fresh snow. One peeked out curiously from behind Koda's hind leg, while the other remained more cautious. Ethan felt his breath hitch. Koda had returned. With his family. A full circle moment. The sanctuary fell into absolute silence. Every person present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Koda, the bear who had once been rescued as an orphan, had become a father. And, somehow, against all logic, he had chosen to introduce his cubs to the place where he had once been raised. The implications were staggering. No wild bear had ever been observed bringing offspring back to a human-influenced environment by choice. But here Koda stood, his powerful frame relaxed. His cubs watching their father's every move. Ethan took a slow step forward, heart pounding. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand. He simply stood, just as he had done all those years ago when Koda was a cub. The great bear let out a deep exhale, his breath fogging the cold air. Then, as if completing an unspoken cycle, he lifted his right paw. The sanctuary staff held their breath. One of Koda's cubs, the braver of the two, tentatively copied the gesture, raising its small paw in the same motion. Tears burned at the corners of Ethan's eyes. The legacy of trust had passed to another generation. A new beginning. Koda remained at the perimeter for nearly an hour, his cubs cautiously exploring the snow before returning to his side. Then, just as before, he turned back toward the forest. His massive frame disappearing into the trees. But this time, it wasn't a farewell. It was a promise. And Ethan knew, without a doubt, that one day, Koda, or perhaps his cubs, would return again. The sanctuary had been his first home. And no matter how far he roamed, it would always be part of him. The night Koda returned with his cubs marked a turning point, not just for Ethan, but for the entire world of wildlife conservation. It was more than a rare event, it was a testament to the depth of memory, connection, and trust between species. What had started as an extraordinary reunion had now evolved into something far greater, a legacy that would change the way people understood the wild. Ethan stood at the edge of the sanctuary long after Koda disappeared into the trees once again. His heart was full, yet his mind raced with questions. What did this mean? Why had Koda brought his cubs? Would they return? But deep down, he already knew the answer. The connection between them had not only survived, it had been passed on. The scientific frenzy. The following weeks were a whirlwind of media attention. Research inquiries, and endless discussions among experts. Scientists, conservationists, and journalists from around the world were now focused on Evergreen Ridge Sanctuary. The footage of Koda's return with his cubs had been analyzed in microscopic detail. Was it instinct? Learned behavior? Or something entirely new? Dr. Julian Carter, the same researcher who had declared Koda's initial return a breakthrough in animal cognition, now had even bigger questions. "This is unprecedented," he stated during an international wildlife summit. "No recorded case has ever shown a rehabilitated bear not only remembering its human caretaker after so long, but also introducing its offspring to that human and the sanctuary where it was raised. This suggests intergenerational memory, something we never thought possible in wild animals." Suddenly, everything in the field of wildlife rehabilitation was being re-evaluated. Could animals pass down learned experiences in ways more complex than scientists had previously believed? Ethan, however, wasn't interested in theories. For him, this wasn't about proving a scientific anomaly. It was about Koda. It was about trust. And it was about what happened next. The watchful guardian. Months passed, and the sanctuary returned to its normal rhythms, though something had shifted. The land itself felt different, as if holding on to the memory of Koda's presence. Trail cameras set up around the perimeter often caught glimpses of a massive brown bear watching from a distance. Sometimes, he was alone. Other times, the faint figures of his cubs could be seen trailing behind him, learning the ways of the forest. He never approached the sanctuary buildings again, never lingered near the fences. But Ethan knew, Koda was still there. One evening, while making his final rounds before nightfall, Ethan stopped near the observation tower and gazed out over the rolling hills beyond the sanctuary's borders. And there, at the crest of a distant ridge, stood Koda. The great bear stood tall, silhouetted against the setting sun, his form unmistakable. One of his cubs, now noticeably larger, stood beside him, mirroring his stance. For a long moment, they simply stood there. Ethan didn't raise his hand. He didn't call out. He didn't move at all. And then, as if completing an unspoken promise, Koda turned and disappeared into the wild, his cub following closely behind. It was not a goodbye. It was an understanding. A future shaped by the past. As the years went by, Ethan continued his work at the sanctuary, training new generations of conservationists. Teaching them the delicate balance of helping without taming, nurturing without domesticating. Koda's story became a lesson in every lecture, every training program. The bear who remembered. The bear who returned. The bear who introduced his family to the place where he had been saved. Researchers continued studying the impact of his return. Some argued that Koda had simply acted on instinct, drawn back by familiarity. Others insisted it was something deeper, something that transcended mere survival. Ethan didn't need an explanation. He already knew the truth. One crisp autumn morning, he sat on the porch of the main lodge, watching the sun rise over the sanctuary. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, carrying the distant calls of birds and the rustling of unseen creatures. A young intern walked up beside him, holding a fresh cup of coffee. She had heard the stories but had never seen Koda herself. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" she asked softly, as if afraid to break the peace of the morning. Ethan smiled, taking a slow sip of coffee before answering. "He never really left. The legacy lives on." Years later, as Ethan prepared to retire, the sanctuary continued to thrive. More animals were rescued, more lives were saved, and more knowledge was passed on. On his final day, as he packed his belongings and prepared to leave, he took one last walk through the sanctuary grounds. Stopping at the river where Koda had once learned to fish, he crouched down, running his fingers through the cool water. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the little cub who had once splashed here, who had once trusted him enough to follow his guidance, who had grown into a guardian of his own family. As he stood and turned back toward the lodge, he felt a shift in the air. And then, from somewhere beyond the trees, came a sound he had not heard in years. A low, rumbling greeting. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly. Heart pounding. For just a fraction of a second, through the golden light of the setting sun, he saw him. A bear, older now, larger, more powerful. Standing at the tree line. Koda. And beside him, another figure, a younger bear, fully grown, but with the same deep eyes, the same powerful stance. Koda had returned. Not alone. But with his son. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Emotion swelling within him. The two bears stood there for a long moment before, as always, turning and fading into the wild. But this time, Ethan knew. The legacy would never die. Koda had not just survived. He had passed something down. A memory. A connection. A truth that would live on beyond any one lifetime. And that was enough. Lessons in compassion and connection. The story of Ethan and Koda is more than just a tale of reunion, it is a testament to the deep, unspoken connections that exist between humans and the natural world. Their journey offers profound lessons that extend far beyond one man and one bear. The power of memory and trust. Koda's return after 8 years in the wild defied scientific expectations, proving that trust, once built, is not so easily forgotten. This challenges us to reconsider the depth of memory and emotional bonds in all living beings. Nature and nurture can coexist. The idea that humans should have no emotional connection with wild animals has long been debated. Ethan's relationship with Koda demonstrates that compassionate care does not weaken a creature's ability to thrive in its natural habitat, it can instead strengthen it. A legacy of kindness endures. Koda did not just return, he introduced his cubs to the sanctuary, symbolizing the passing of memory across generations. In the same way, acts of kindness and respect toward nature create ripples that extend far beyond a single lifetime. Wildlife conservation is more than science, while research and biology play a crucial role. Koda's story proves that conservation also requires understanding, respect, and heart. Protecting wildlife is not just about survival, it's about preserving the stories, relationships, and unspoken connections that define our world. Home is not just a place, but a connection. Koda found his home not just in the wilderness but in the memories of those who had once cared for him. Similarly, our impact on nature is not measured only in the spaces we protect but in the relationships we build with the world around us. The tale of Ethan and Koda reminds us that nature is full of mysteries we have yet to fully understand. But one truth is undeniable: compassion leaves an imprint that time and distance cannot erase. Join the conversation and support wildlife conservation. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. What are your thoughts on the incredible bond between Ethan and Koda? Have you ever witnessed a powerful connection between humans and animals? We'd love to hear your stories and insights. If you believe in the importance of protecting wildlife and preserving their stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life, raising awareness and making a difference for animals around the world. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. Every view, every share, and every comment helps spread awareness and contributes to the ongoing efforts of wildlife conservation. Share this story with your friends and family. Together, we can continue to protect and cherish the natural world and the incredible creatures that call it home. Thank you for being part of this journey.